Hey guys, before the video starts, I want to say that I added a join button where you can become member of Mr.Prodanov's family, listen to the stories with no ads, and receive shout out every new video. And also, to all those who are new, feel free to subscribe. It can help a lot. I thought I was helping people escape their past on the dark web, but I soon realized I was facilitating a sinister game of cat and mouse with unknown players. I never thought I'd get so deep into the dark web. It started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself. I was just another tech-savvy guy curious about the hidden corners of the internet. At first, it was just a hobby, a way to explore the unknown. But soon, it became something more, a mission even. I thought I was helping people, but now I know I was just a pawn in a twisted game. It all began a few months ago. I was browsing a dark web forum when I stumbled upon a post from someone claiming to need help escaping their past. They were desperate, pleading for assistance. The details were vague, but the fear was palpable. I was intrigued and maybe a bit too confident in my abilities. I responded to the post, offering my help. We communicated through encrypted messages, and they told me their story. They claimed to be on the run from an abusive ex-partner who was stalking them. They needed a new identity, a fresh start. I had some experience with creating false identities, so I agreed to help. Looking back, I realized how naive I was. I spent days crafting a new identity for them. Fake documents, social media profiles, the works. It was almost too easy. Once everything was set up, I sent them the details and wished them luck. They were grateful, and I felt like I had done something good. But then, the requests kept coming. More people reached out to me, each with their own sob story. Some were escaping abusive relationships. Others were fleeing debts or criminal records. I started to see myself as some kind of digital savior, helping people start over. It felt good, almost addictive. One night, I received a message that changed everything. It was from someone named Jane. Her story was the most disturbing yet. She claimed to be trapped in a basement by a sadistic kidnapper who found her through a dark web human trafficking ring. She begged for help, saying her captor was planning to kill her soon. My heart raced as I read her message. I couldn't just ignore it. I replied, asking for more details. Jane sent me photos of the basement, a small, dank room with chains on the walls and a single grimy mattress. She described her captor in chilling detail, a tall man with a scar across his face and dead, soulless eyes. I worked frantically to trace her location. It wasn't easy, but eventually I managed to narrow it down to a small town in the middle of nowhere. I contacted the local police, but they dismissed my claims as a prank. I was furious and scared for Jane's life. Desperate, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I packed some basic supplies, including a knife for protection, and drove to the town. It took hours, but I finally arrived. I used the clues Jane had given me to find the house, a decrepit old building on the outskirts of town. I parked a few blocks away and approached the house on foot. It was dark, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding. I crept around the back, looking for a way in. The basement window was small, but big enough to crawl through. I pried it open and slipped inside, landing softly on the cold concrete floor. The basement was exactly as Jane had described. My heart pounded as I searched for her. Suddenly, I heard a faint whimper from the corner. There she was, chained to the wall, looking even more terrified than I had imagined. I rushed to her side, trying to reassure her. "Jane, it's me. I'm here to help you." She looked up at me with wide, haunted eyes. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Before I could respond, I heard the sound of footsteps above. My blood ran cold. Jane's captor was home. I had no choice but to hide. I found a dark corner and crouched down, holding my breath. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. The basement door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. I recognized him from Jane's description, the scar, the dead eyes. He walked over to Jane, inspecting her chains. "You've been quiet today," he muttered. "Maybe you're finally learning." Jane said nothing, just stared at the floor. I could see her trembling. The man suddenly turned and started walking towards my hiding spot. My heart pounded in my chest. I gripped the knife, ready to defend myself. But just as he was about to reach me, his phone rang. He cursed under his breath and answered it. "What?" he barked into the phone. There was a long pause. "Yeah, I'll be there soon." He hung up and turned back to Jane. "Looks like you get a reprieve. Don't go anywhere." With that, he left the basement, slamming the door behind him. I waited until I was sure he was gone before emerging from my hiding spot. Jane looked at me with a mix of relief and fear. "We need to get out of here now," I whispered. I used the knife to cut her chains, and we crawled out through the window. We ran to my car, not stopping until we were miles away. Jane was safe, but the ordeal had taken its toll on both of us. As we drove, Jane told me the truth. She wasn't just running from her captor. She was running from a network of people who played a twisted game of cat and mouse on the dark web. They would kidnap and release their victims, only to hunt them down again. And I had just unwittingly inserted myself into their sick game. I thought I was helping people, but I was only making things worse. And now, I was a target too. We drove in silence for what felt like hours. My mind was racing, trying to process everything Jane had told me. I thought I was helping people, but instead, I had become a pawn in a game far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. Jane was slumped in the passenger seat, her eyes vacant. I could tell she was in shock. I didn't know what to say, so I just kept driving until we reached a small rundown motel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was somewhere to hide, at least for the night. We checked in under fake names and made our way to the room. Jane immediately collapsed on the bed, exhausted. I sat on the edge, my head in my hands. How had things gone so wrong? After a while, Jane started to talk. She told me about the dark web forum where her nightmare began. It was a place where people with money and power indulged their darkest fantasies. They would bid on human lives, turning innocent people into prey for their sick hunts. Jane had been one of their victims, and now, because of my interference, I was too. "They won't stop," she said, her voice trembling. "They never stop. They enjoy the chase too much." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. I had seen the depths of depravity on the dark web, and this was just another layer. I felt sick to my stomach. "We need to figure out a plan," I said, trying to sound confident. "We can't just keep running." Jane nodded, though she looked doubtful. "There's a man who might help us," she said. "He used to be part of the network, but got out. He knows how they operate." "Where can we find him?" I asked. "He lives off the grid, somewhere in the mountains. It won't be easy to get to him, but it's our only chance." With no other options, we decided to take the risk. The next morning, we packed up and left the motel, heading towards the mountains. The drive was long and tense, with every passing car making my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we ascended the winding mountain roads, the scenery became more remote and desolate. It was the perfect place for someone to hide. We finally reached a small, secluded cabin nestled in the woods. Jane assured me this was the place. We approached cautiously, and I knocked on the door. After a few tense moments, it creaked open, revealing an older man with a weathered face and piercing eyes. "Jane," he said, recognizing her immediately. "What the hell are you doing here?" "We need your help, Tom," Jane replied. "They're after us." Tom's expression darkened, and he stepped aside to let us in. The cabin was sparse but functional, with a fireplace and a few pieces of worn furniture. Tom gestured for us to sit. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, sitting across from us. "They'll find you, and when they do, they'll kill all of us." "We don't have anywhere else to go," I said. "Please, we need to know how to stop them." Tom sighed and ran a hand through his graying hair. "There's only one way to stop them," he said. "You have to expose them, but it's dangerous. They have connections everywhere." "How do we do that?" Jane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom explained that the network had a central hub, a hidden server where all their communications and transactions took place. If we could hack into it and gather evidence, we could bring them down. But getting to the server wouldn't be easy. It was heavily guarded, both physically and digitally. "We'll need a team," Tom said. "People we can trust. And even then, there's no guarantee we'll make it out alive." I glanced at Jane, who looked more determined than ever. "We have to try," she said. Tom nodded reluctantly. "All right. There's a group of hackers I know who might help us, but it's going to cost, and they'll want assurances." "We'll do whatever it takes," I said, my voice firm. Over the next few days, we stayed in the cabin, making plans and gathering resources. Tom contacted the hackers, arranging a meeting. The tension was palpable, and sleep was a luxury none of us could afford. One night, while Jane was resting, Tom pulled me aside. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low. "Jane isn't just any victim. She was once one of them." I stared at him, shocked. "What do you mean?" "She was part of the network, but she tried to leave. They don't take kindly to that. They've been hunting her ever since." The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. Jane had lied to me, but I couldn't entirely blame her. She was a victim in her own right, trapped in a web of her own making. "Does she know you know?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "No, and you shouldn't tell her. It'll only make things worse." I agreed, but the knowledge weighed heavily on me. Trust was a rare commodity, and I wasn't sure who I could rely on anymore. The next day, we set off to meet the hackers. They were a ragtag group, living in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a nearby city. They were skeptical at first, but Tom managed to convince them of the importance of our mission. "We're in," their leader, a wiry guy named Max, said. "But if this goes south, we're all dead." With the team assembled, we began planning the heist. It was a race against time, with the hunters closing in on us. The pressure was immense, but we had no choice. We had to see this through to the end. As we made our final preparations, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The hunters were always one step ahead, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was a traitor among us. But there was no turning back now. We were about to dive headfirst into the lion's den, and only time would tell if we'd come out alive. The night of the heist, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. We had everything planned down to the smallest detail, but the risk was immense. One wrong move, and we'd all be dead. Max and his team were ready, their fingers poised over keyboards, ready to breach the network's defenses. Tom and I would handle the physical infiltration, with Jane providing support from our makeshift command center. We piled into a van and drove to the target location, a seemingly innocuous office building in the heart of the city. According to Tom, the server was hidden in the basement, guarded by both physical and digital security measures. Max's team would disable the cameras and alarms, while Tom and I made our way inside. As we approached the building, I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The streets were eerily quiet, adding to the tension. Max's voice crackled through my earpiece. "We're in. Cameras are down. You're clear to go." Tom and I exited the van and made our way to a side entrance. He picked the lock with practiced ease, and we slipped inside. The building was dark and silent, save for the faint hum of electronics. We moved quickly but cautiously, making our way down a flight of stairs to the basement. We reached a heavy steel door, the final barrier between us and the server. I glanced at Tom, who nodded. I pulled out a small device and attached it to the keypad. After a few tense moments, the lock clicked open. We pushed the door ajar and stepped inside. The server room was cold, the air thick with the smell of ozone. Racks of servers blinked and hummed, the heart of the network's operations. We had to act fast. I plugged in a USB drive containing Max's custom malware and watched as lines of code scrolled across the screen. It was designed to extract and transmit all the data to a secure location, providing the evidence we needed to expose the network. As the data transfer progressed, my heart pounded in my chest. We were so close. But then, everything went wrong. "Incoming!" Max's voice shouted through the earpiece. "You've got company. Get out now!" Panic surged through me. I glanced at Tom, who was already moving towards the door. I grabbed the USB drive, yanking it out of the server, and followed him. We ran through the basement, our footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of pursuit, heavy boots and angry voices. We burst through the side entrance and into the alleyway, only to be confronted by a group of armed men. They wore black tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks. One of them stepped forward, aiming his gun at us. "Stop right there." We had no choice but to comply. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The leader of the group approached, ripping the earpiece from my head and crushing it underfoot. He glanced at Tom, then back at me. "You've made a big mistake," he said, his voice cold and menacing. "You thought you could outsmart us, but you were wrong." Before I could respond, I felt a sharp pain in my side. I looked down to see a tranquilizer dart protruding from my abdomen. My vision blurred, and I collapsed to the ground, darkness closing in. When I came to, I was in a different basement, this one even more grim than the last. Chains hung from the walls, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. I was bound to a chair, my wrists and ankles secured with heavy metal cuffs. Tom was next to me, similarly restrained. Jane stood across the room, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. The leader of the group stood in front of us, his mask removed. He was the man with the scar, the one who had held Jane captive. "Welcome to the game," he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You thought you could take us down, but all you did was make yourselves the next targets." I struggled against my bonds, but it was no use. The leader approached Jane, grabbing her by the hair and forcing her to look at us. "Tell them," he commanded. Jane's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I tried to warn you. There's no escaping them." The leader released her and turned back to us. "You're going to play a new game now," he said. "It's called Survival, and it's going to be the last game you ever play." He motioned to his men, who unchained Tom and dragged him to the center of the room. One of them handed him a knife. "Kill him," the leader ordered, pointing at me. "Or we kill her." Tom looked at me, his eyes filled with terror and regret. I shook my head, trying to convey that he shouldn't do it, but I knew he had no choice. He hesitated for a moment, then lunged at me. The knife plunged into my side, and I screamed in agony. The pain was blinding, but I couldn't pass out. Not yet. "Again," the leader commanded. "Make it count." Tom pulled the knife out, tears streaming down his face. He raised it again, but before he could strike, there was a commotion at the door. Max and his team burst in, guns blazing. The room erupted in chaos. In the confusion, Tom dropped the knife and rushed to my side. He fumbled with the chains, trying to free me. I could see Max and his team taking down the guards, but the leader was nowhere to be seen. As Tom finally unlocked my cuffs, the leader appeared behind him, gun in hand. There was a deafening bang, and Tom collapsed, blood pooling around him. I screamed, but there was nothing I could do. Max shot the leader, who fell to the ground lifeless. Jane ran to us, her face pale and stricken. She helped me to my feet, and we staggered out of the basement, leaving the carnage behind. We made it back to the van where Max's team was waiting. They had managed to retrieve the data from the server, but the cost had been high. Tom was gone, and we were all scarred, physically and emotionally. As we drove away, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of despair. We had won, but at what cost? The network had been exposed, but the game was far from over. I knew they would come for us, and this time, there would be no escape. The aftermath of the raid left us reeling. Max's team had managed to secure the data, but the victory felt hollow. Tom's death weighed heavily on us, and the realization that we were still in danger gnawed at my sanity. We relocated to a safe house that Max's team had prepared, a remote cabin deep in the woods, isolated from prying eyes. Jane and I were both on edge. The paranoia was suffocating. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the cabin felt like a harbinger of doom. We knew the network wouldn't take this lying down. They would regroup, and they would come after us with a vengeance. Days turned into weeks. We laid low, avoiding any digital footprint that could give away our location. Max and his team worked tirelessly to decrypt the data and compile evidence that could bring the network to justice. The more they uncovered, the deeper the rabbit hole went. This wasn't just a group of sadistic hunters. It was an entire organization with connections in high places, politicians, law enforcement, even major corporations. One night, as we were gathered around the dining table, Max finally broke the silence. "We have enough to expose them," he said, his voice grim. "But we need to be smart about this. If we go public too soon, they'll crush us before we have a chance." "How do we do it then?" I asked, my voice hoarse. I was still recovering from the stab wounds, and every breath was a reminder of Tom's sacrifice. We need to disseminate the information through multiple channels at once. Anonymous leaks, media outlets, whistleblower organizations. It has to be a coordinated strike, so they can't shut it all down at once. We spent the next few days preparing for the release. Max's team set up secure connections and encrypted files. Jane and I helped as best we could, though the tension was almost unbearable. The night before the planned release, we sat together, trying to find some semblance of calm. "Do you think it'll work?" Jane asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It has to," I replied, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. We don't have any other choice. The following day, we executed our plan. Max's team sent the data to dozens of sources simultaneously. We watched anxiously as the information began to spread. News outlets picked up the story. Social media exploded with outrage, and whistleblower sites confirmed the authenticity of the leaks. For a brief moment, it felt like we had won. The world was finally seeing the network for what it was, a monstrous machine of corruption and cruelty. But our celebration was short-lived. That night, the safe house was attacked. It happened so fast. One moment we were watching the news, the next, the windows shattered as smoke grenades were thrown inside. The air filled with choking gas, and we scrambled to escape. Max's team fought back, but the attackers were well prepared. Armed men in tactical gear stormed the cabin, their faces hidden behind masks. I grabbed Jane's hand, pulling her towards the back door. We stumbled into the woods, the sounds of gunfire and shouts echoing behind us. My lungs burned, and my wounds throbbed, but we kept running. The forest was dense, offering some cover, but I knew they were right behind us. We ran for what felt like hours, finally collapsing near a small stream. I could hear the distant sounds of the attackers searching for us. We had to keep moving, but I was exhausted, and Jane wasn't in much better shape. "We can't stop," Jane whispered, her voice filled with desperation. "They'll find us." "I know," I replied, struggling to my feet. "But we need a plan." As we moved deeper into the forest, I realized our only hope was to reach civilization and find help. We stumbled upon a dirt road, and after what felt like an eternity, a car approached. I waved it down, praying the driver would stop. A middle-aged man in a pickup truck pulled over, his eyes widening as he saw our disheveled state. "What happened to you two?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Please, we need help," I gasped. "We're being chased. Can you take us to the nearest town?" The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Get in." We climbed into the truck, and he sped off, the sounds of the forest fading behind us. As we drove, I explained our situation in as much detail as I could. The man, whose name was Joe, listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each passing minute. "You're saying there's a whole network of these bastards?" he asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Yes," Jane replied, "and they're not going to stop until we're dead." Joe nodded grimly. "I know a place where you can lay low for a while. It's not much, but it's safe." We followed Joe's directions, and he led us to an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town. The place was secluded, with fields stretching out in all directions. Joe's family owned the property, and he assured us no one would find us there. We thanked him and settled into the farmhouse, trying to catch our breath. The fear and tension were still palpable, but for the first time in days, we felt a glimmer of hope. As we sat in the farmhouse, Max called us on a secure line. "The information is out there," he said. "The public knows, and the authorities are starting to act, but you need to stay hidden. They'll come for you with everything they've got." "We'll be careful," I promised. The next few weeks were a blur. We stayed off the grid, moving from place to place, never staying anywhere too long. The network was relentless, but so were we. With every passing day, more people came forward, exposing the horrors of the organization. It wasn't long before high-profile arrests were made, and the network's power began to crumble. But even as the tide turned, I knew the fight was far from over. The network was vast, and its roots ran deep. We had won a battle, but the war was still raging. As Jane and I huddled in yet another safe house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and every creak of the floorboards sent a shiver down my spine. "We'll keep fighting," Jane said, her hand gripping mine tightly. "We have to." I nodded, knowing she was right. We had come too far to give up now. The network might have started this game, but we were determined to finish it. And so we continued our journey, always looking over our shoulders, always ready for the next attack. The dark web had shown us its worst, but it had also revealed our strength. We were survivors, and we wouldn't rest until the network was destroyed once and for all. The months that followed were a nightmare of constant movement and vigilance. Jane and I learned to sleep in shifts, always one of us awake and alert. We never stayed in one place for more than a few days, relying on the kindness of strangers and the remnants of Max's network to keep us hidden. The tension was unbearable, but the thought of seeing the network brought to justice kept us going. News of the arrests and the ongoing investigations into the network gave us a glimmer of hope, but we knew that as long as the key players remained free, we would never be truly safe. Max continued to provide us with updates, working tirelessly to unravel the web of corruption and cruelty that had ensnared so many lives. One evening, as we huddled in a dingy motel room, Max called with urgent news. "We found their headquarters," he said, his voice tinged with both excitement and caution. "It's a fortified compound in the middle of nowhere. This is our chance to take them down once and for all." A mixture of fear and determination surged through me. This was it, the final confrontation. "What do we need to do?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "We're assembling a team," Max replied, "but we need your help. You and Jane are the only ones who know their tactics inside out. We need you to guide us through this." Jane looked at me, her eyes filled with a steely resolve. "We're in," she said firmly. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Max arranged for a group of former military personnel and hackers to join us. We reviewed the plans endlessly, going over every detail, every possible contingency. The compound was heavily guarded, with high-tech security systems and armed personnel. This would be the most dangerous mission we had ever undertaken. Finally, the night of the raid arrived. We gathered in a secluded location near the compound, our hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. Max's team had managed to disable some of the security systems remotely, but we still had to deal with the physical guards and the remaining defenses. We moved under the cover of darkness, our breaths visible in the cold night air. The compound loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. We split into small groups, each with a specific objective. Jane and I were tasked with infiltrating the main building and locating the server room, where we could gather the final pieces of evidence. As we approached the perimeter, my heart raced. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every sound a potential danger. But we pressed on, driven by the need to see this through. We reached the main building without incident, slipping inside through a side entrance. The corridors were eerily silent, the dim lighting casting long, ominous shadows. We moved quickly, guided by the blueprints Max had provided. Suddenly, we heard footsteps approaching. We ducked into a nearby room, holding our breaths as the guards passed by. My hand tightened around the handle of the knife I carried, ready to defend myself if necessary. Once the guards were gone, we continued towards the server room. We found it behind a reinforced door, secured with a biometric lock. Jane pulled out a device we had brought, designed to bypass such systems. After a few tense moments, the lock clicked open, and we slipped inside. The server room was a maze of blinking lights and humming machinery. We connected our equipment to the central server and began the data transfer. Every second felt like an eternity, the tension almost unbearable. Just as the transfer was nearing completion, the door burst open. The leader of the network, the scarred man, stood there, flanked by armed guards. His eyes were cold and calculating, filled with a chilling rage. "You really thought you could take us down?" he sneered. "You're fools." Before we could react, gunfire erupted. The room became a chaotic blur of sound and motion. Jane and I dove for cover, firing back with everything we had. The leader's men were well trained, but desperation gave us an edge. In the midst of the chaos, the leader grabbed Jane, dragging her towards the door. I saw red. With a primal scream, I charged at him, tackling him to the ground. We struggled, grappling for control. His strength was formidable, but my rage fueled me. I managed to wrestle his gun away and fired, the shot echoing through the room. The leader collapsed, a look of shock and fury on his face. I turned to Jane, who was shaken but unharmed. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice steady. We completed the data transfer and set charges around the servers. As we made our way out, the building shook with explosions. The compound was in chaos, and we used the confusion to slip away. Outside, Max's team had successfully neutralized the remaining guards. We regrouped, adrenaline still coursing through our veins. The network's headquarters lay in ruins, the final blow dealt to their operations. As we drove away from the compound, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. We had won, but the cost had been high. Tom's sacrifice and the horrors we had endured would stay with us forever. In the following weeks, the evidence we had gathered led to a series of high-profile arrests and investigations. The network's influence was dismantled, and many of its victims found justice at last. Jane and I tried to rebuild our lives, haunted by the memories, but determined to move forward. The dark web had shown us the worst of humanity, but it had also revealed our resilience and strength. We had faced the abyss and emerged on the other side, scarred but unbroken. And though the shadows of our past would always linger, we knew we had made a difference. In the end, we had turned the game against its creators, proving that even in the darkest corners of the web, light could still prevail. Thank you for following our story. I stumbled upon a dark web game that dared me to commit a crime. I've always been the type of person who liked to push boundaries. Growing up in a small town where everyone knew each other's business, I got bored easily. So, when I heard about the dark web, I was naturally curious. I mean, who wouldn't be? It's this mysterious, forbidden corner of the internet where anything and everything is possible. So, a few months ago, I decided to explore it. What I found, I wish I could forget. I had been lurking on various forums, reading about the different kinds of things you could find there. Drugs, weapons, counterfeit money, you name it. But one night, I stumbled upon a thread that caught my eye. It was titled, "Play or Die, the Ultimate Game." Intrigued, I clicked on it. The post was simple. It claimed to be an invitation to a game that promised thrills beyond your wildest imagination. All you had to do was provide your email address and you'd get instructions. In hindsight, it was stupid to give out my email, but I was drunk and bored, so I did it. The next day, I received an email. The subject line read, "Welcome to the game." Inside, there was a link and a set of instructions. I was to download a specific browser, access a certain site, and create an account. The email warned me that this was not a game for the faint-hearted and that I should be prepared for anything. I laughed it off. How bad could it be? I followed the instructions and soon found myself on a site that looked like a twisted version of a social media platform. There were profiles, but they were all anonymous. No names, just numbers. Mine was Player 197. I was welcomed with a message that read, "Welcome to the game. Your first task will be given shortly. Failure to complete it will result in consequences." I waited for a few minutes and then a new message popped up. Task 1. Steal something valuable from a stranger. Proof required. My heart raced. This was crazy, but at the same time, it was exhilarating. I decided to go through with it. I headed to a nearby park, found a woman sitting alone on a bench, and snatched her purse. I ran like hell and didn't stop until I was safely back home. I took a picture of the purse and sent it in. Within minutes, I received another message. Task completed. Well done, Player 197. Your next task will be given soon. Over the next few weeks, the tasks escalated. Vandalism, theft, breaking into abandoned buildings. Each task was more dangerous and illegal than the last. But the adrenaline rush was addictive. I felt alive in a way I never had before. Then came the night of the 5th task. It was a Friday, and I had just gotten home from work. I was exhausted and contemplating quitting the game. That's when I received the message that would change everything. Task 5. Harm someone. Proof required. I stared at the screen, my stomach in knots. This was too far. I was about to close the browser when another message appeared. Failure to complete the task will result in consequences. Attached was a picture of my apartment building, taken from the outside. They knew where I lived. Panic set in. I felt trapped. I considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? That I was participating in a dark web game, and now they were threatening me. They'd think I was crazy. I needed to think. I needed to figure out who was behind this and how they knew so much about me. I spent the weekend in a state of paranoia. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. I barely slept. By Sunday night, I was a wreck. That's when I received the next message. Final warning, Player 197. Complete the task or face the consequences. Desperate, I decided to comply. I couldn't think of any other way out. I left my apartment and wandered the streets, looking for a target. It was late, and the streets were mostly empty. I finally spotted a homeless man sleeping in an alley. My heart pounded As I approached him, I pulled out a knife I had taken from my kitchen and with shaking hands slashed his arm. He screamed, and I ran, the sound echoing in my ears. I made it back to my apartment, shaking and covered in sweat. I sent in the proof and waited. Task completed. Well done, Player 197. Your next task will be given shortly. I felt sick. This had to end. I couldn't do this anymore. But the game wasn't over. The next task arrived, and it was worse than anything before. Task 6. Abduct someone. Proof required. I knew I couldn't do it, but I also knew they were watching me. I needed to find a way to stop this. I needed to find out who was behind it and make them pay. But first, I needed to survive. And to do that, I had to play the game. My mind was racing. Abduct someone? How the hell was I supposed to do that? I was no criminal mastermind, just a regular guy who got in way over his head. But I knew I had no choice. If I didn't comply, who knew what they would do to me? I felt like a hunted animal, trapped and desperate. I spent hours researching. I read about kidnappings, how to avoid being caught, what mistakes to avoid. Every article made me more nauseous, but I couldn't stop. I had to get this right. I decided the best way was to find someone who wouldn't be missed right away. Someone like the homeless man I had already hurt. It felt horrific to even consider, but what other option did I have? I spent the next few nights scouting locations, looking for potential targets. I found a small tent community under a bridge on the outskirts of town. They were vulnerable, and no one would notice if one of them went missing for a while. I hated myself for even thinking this way, but I was too deep to back out now. The plan was simple. I would lure one of them with the promise of food and money. Once they were close enough, I would drug them and transport them to an abandoned warehouse I had found during one of my earlier tasks. It was isolated, the perfect place to keep someone hidden. That night, I packed a duffel bag with everything I needed. A syringe filled with a powerful sedative I had bought online, rope, duct tape, and a tarp. My hands trembled as I prepared, the reality of what I was about to do sinking in. I felt like I was on the brink of a breakdown, but I couldn't afford to lose it now. I drove to the bridge, parked a few blocks away, and walked the rest of the way. The area was dark, lit only by a few flickering streetlights. I approached the tents, heart pounding in my chest. I spotted a man sitting alone, smoking a cigarette. He looked about my age, maybe a bit older, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. "Hey man," I called out, trying to sound casual. "You hungry? I got some food and a bit of cash if you want it." He looked up, suspicion flashing in his eyes, but hunger won out. "Yeah, sure. What you got?" "Come with me. I left it in my car. It's just a couple of blocks away." He hesitated, but then got up and followed me. My palms were sweaty, and I could barely breathe. This was it. I was really doing this. We walked in silence, and when we reached the alley where I had parked, I turned to him. "The food's in the trunk. Just a sec." I opened the trunk and pretended to rummage around. When he got close enough, I pulled out the syringe and jabbed it into his neck. He let out a grunt of surprise, then crumpled to the ground. I worked quickly, tying his hands and feet with the rope, wrapping his mouth with duct tape. I covered him with the tarp and hoisted him into the trunk. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. I slammed the trunk shut and got into the driver's seat, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I drove to the warehouse, constantly checking my mirrors, sure that at any moment the police would pull me over. but the streets were empty, and I made it to the warehouse without incident. I dragged the man inside and tied him to a chair. He was still unconscious, his head lolled to one side. I took a picture of him and sent it to the game administrators. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Task completed. Well done, player 197. Your next task will be given shortly. I stared at the message, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. How much further would this go? How much more could I take? I waited for the man to wake up, pacing the room, my mind a whirlwind of fear and guilt. When he finally stirred, his eyes blinking open in confusion, I felt a pang of remorse. What had I done? How had I become this monster? Where am I? What's going on? He mumbled, his voice thick with sedation. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I'm sorry, I said, my voice shaking. I had no choice. His eyes widened with fear, and he struggled against the ropes. Please, let me go. I won't tell anyone. I swear. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let him go and end this nightmare. But I knew it wasn't that simple. The game was in control, and I was just a pawn. I needed to find a way out. But first, I had to survive. As I waited for the next task, I knew one thing for certain. I was in too deep, and there was no turning back now. The minutes felt like hours as I sat in that cold, dark warehouse, waiting for the next task. My captive had stopped struggling, and the room was filled with an eerie silence. I couldn't stop thinking about how my life had spiraled into this nightmare. I was no longer just a thrill seeker. I was a criminal, a kidnapper. The guilt was suffocating, but the fear of what the game might do to me was even worse. My phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I picked it up with trembling hands and read the new message. Task 7. Extract information from your captive. Proof required. My stomach churned. This was getting more twisted by the minute. How was I supposed to extract information? What kind of information did they even want? I approached the man, who was now fully awake and glaring at me with a mixture of fear and anger. What do you want from me? He demanded, his voice hoarse. I need to ask you some questions, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Just answer honestly, and I'll let you go. He didn't believe me, and honestly, I didn't blame him. I didn't even believe myself. But I had to get through this somehow. Who are you? Why were you living under that bridge? I asked, trying to sound authoritative. He spat at me, the glob of saliva landing near my feet. Screw you. I'm not telling you anything. I sighed, wiping the spit away with my shoe. This wasn't going to be easy. I rummaged through my duffel bag and found a small utility knife. I didn't want to use it, but I had no choice. I needed to make this look convincing for the game administrators. I approached him again, holding the knife up so he could see it. Look, I don't want to hurt you, but I need answers. Just tell me what I want to know, and this will be over. His eyes widened with fear, but he remained defiant. Go to hell. I felt a pang of panic. What was I supposed to do now? I couldn't actually torture him, could I? But then I thought about the consequences of failing the task. I had seen what these people were capable of. They knew where I lived, and they had proven they could get to me anytime they wanted. I took a deep breath and stilled myself. I had to make it look real. I approached him slowly, knife in hand, and made a small cut on his arm. He winced, but still refused to speak. I cut him again, this time a bit deeper. He let out a cry of pain, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This was wrong, so horribly wrong. Please, I said, my voice cracking. Just tell me something. Anything. I don't want to hurt you. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and pity. My name is Tom. I lost my job, my home, everything. I had nowhere else to go. I took a picture of him, the blood trickling down his arm, and sent it to the game administrators. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Task completed. Well done, player 197. Your next task will be given shortly. I wanted to cry. What had I become? This wasn't me. I was supposed to be a good person, someone who helped others, not hurt them. But the game had twisted me into something unrecognizable. Tom was silent, his head hanging low. I wanted to apologize, to tell him I was sorry for everything, but what good would it do? I was just as trapped as he was. The next task came through, and I read it with a growing sense of dread. Task 8. Erase all evidence. Proof required. I knew what that meant. They wanted me to get rid of Tom, to kill him. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I couldn't do this. I couldn't take another life, especially this not an innocent one. I sat down on the cold concrete floor, my mind racing. There had to be a way out of this. I couldn't keep playing their twisted game. But what choice did I have? They had me cornered, and any attempt to escape would likely end in my own demise. Tom looked up at me, his eyes filled with resignation. Just do it, he said quietly. Get it over with. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I can't. There has to be another way. He sighed. Look, I don't want to die, but I get it. You're in a bad spot. Just make it quick. Okay? I stood up, my legs trembling. I couldn't believe I was actually considering this. I had to think of something. Anything. I picked up my phone and sent a desperate message to the game administrators. There has to be another way. Please, I can't do this. The response was immediate. Failure to complete the task will result in consequences. I looked at Tom, my vision blurry with tears. I couldn't do it. I had to find another way. I turned and ran out of the warehouse, leaving him tied up and bleeding. I got in my car and drove, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get away. As I drove, my phone buzzed again. I ignored it, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I needed help, but who could I turn to? I was alone in this, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. Eventually, I pulled over, my hands shaking. I had to end this. I couldn't keep playing their game. I decided to go to the police. I didn't care if they thought I was crazy. I needed help, and this was the only way out. I drove to the nearest police station and walked inside, my heart pounding. I approached the front desk, my hands still trembling. I need to report a crime, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The officer looked up at me, raising an eyebrow. What kind of crime? I took a deep breath, knowing that my life was about to change forever. I've been participating in a dark web game. They made me kidnap someone. He's tied up in an abandoned warehouse. Please, you have to help him. The officer's eyes widened, and he immediately called for backup. Within minutes, I was in a small interrogation room, recounting everything that had happened. They didn't believe me at first, but when they found Tom and saw the state he was in, they knew I was telling the truth. The game administrators tried to contact me again, but I ignored their messages. The police put me in protective custody, and an investigation was launched. They found traces of the game on the dark web, but tracking down the people behind it was nearly impossible. These were professionals, and they knew how to cover their tracks. I spent weeks in a state of anxiety, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I knew they wouldn't just let me walk away, but I had done the right thing. I had to believe that. Tom was safe, and I was finally free from the game. Or so I thought. One night, I received a package. Inside was a single piece of paper with a chilling message. We're always watching. Play or die. The package sent a chill down my spine. The message was clear. They hadn't forgotten about me. They were still watching, still waiting. I was in deeper than I had ever imagined, and there was no escaping it. Every creak in my apartment, every shadow in the corner of my eye, felt like their eyes on me. I was a prisoner of my own paranoia. The police kept me under protective custody, but it did little to ease my mind. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The fear was all-consuming. They had gotten to me once, and they could do it again. I spent my days going over every detail in my head, trying to figure out how to end this once and for all. Weeks turned into months, and I slowly started to regain a sense of normalcy. The police investigation had hit a dead end, but at least I was still alive. I got a new job, moved to a different apartment, and tried to put the nightmare behind me. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they made their next move. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed. My heart sank as I saw the notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. The subject line read, "Final task." My hands trembled as I read the message. "We haven't forgotten you. Player 197. You've proven yourself resourceful, and we have one final task for you. Complete it, and you'll be free. Fail, and the consequences will be severe." Attached was a video file. I opened it, and my blood ran cold. It was footage of my new apartment taken from inside. The camera panned across my living room, my kitchen, and finally, my bedroom. It ended with a close-up of my face as I slept, blissfully unaware of the intruder. I felt sick. They had been inside my home. They could have done anything to me, and I wouldn't have known. I was more vulnerable than ever. The message continued with instructions for the final task. Kill someone of importance. Proof required. You have 48 hours. I couldn't breathe. This was it. They wanted me to commit murder. I had come this far, but this was a line I couldn't cross. I had to find a way to stop them once and for all. I couldn't let them control me any longer. I spent the next day researching, trying to find any clues that could lead me to the people behind the game. I combed through forums, talked to experts in cybersecurity, and even contacted private investigators. But it felt like I was running in circles. These people were ghosts, leaving no trace behind. Desperation set in as the deadline approached. I couldn't go to the police again. They had done all they could. I needed to take matters into my own hands. I decided to set a trap. If they were watching me, I could use that to my advantage. I bought a small camera and hid it in my living room, aimed at the entrance. I also purchased a cheap burner phone and used it to send an anonymous tip to the police about suspicious activity at my address. It was risky, but I needed to draw them out. That night, I sat in my darkened apartment, waiting. Every creak and groan of the building made my heart race. I checked the camera feed on my phone, hoping to catch a glimpse of my tormentors. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I was starting to lose hope when I heard the faint sound of footsteps outside my door. I held my breath, watching the camera feed. The door slowly creaked open, and a figure slipped inside. My blood ran cold as I recognized the mask from the video. They were here. I waited until they were fully inside before dialing the burner phone and calling the police. The masked figure moved silently through my apartment, unaware of the camera capturing their every move. I stayed hidden, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes later, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. The figure froze, then turned to leave, but it was too late. The police burst through the door, guns drawn, and tackled the intruder to the ground. I emerged from my hiding place, shaking with relief. The police arrested the masked figure, but I knew this wasn't over. They were just one cog in a much larger machine. The investigation would continue, and I would have to stay vigilant. As the police led the intruder away, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could finally be free. But deep down, I knew the game was far from over. The people behind it were still out there, still watching, and as long as they were, I would never truly be safe. That night, I received one final message. Well played, player 197. But remember, the game never ends. The message echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder that the nightmare was far from over. The game never ends. I had taken down one of their pawns, but the true masterminds were still out there, watching my every move. I couldn't let my guard down. Not now, not ever. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews and media frenzy. The masked intruder was a low-level operative, someone who had been coerced into participating just like me. The authorities tried to trace the origins of the game, but it was like chasing shadows. Every lead ended in a dead end. Every clue a frustrating piece of a puzzle that refused to be solved. I knew I couldn't rely on the police to keep me safe. I had to take matters into my own hands. I upgraded my home security, installed cameras in every room, and changed my routines daily to avoid being predictable. Paranoia became my constant companion, but it was better than the alternative. I spent hours online, diving deeper into the dark web, trying to find any hint of the game or its creators. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, but I was determined. Every night, I sat in front of my computer, scouring forums and chat rooms, looking for patterns, for anything that could give me an edge. One night, after weeks of fruitless searching, I found a thread that seemed promising. It was on a hidden forum, one I hadn't come across before. The thread was titled, "Survivors of the Game." My heart raced as I clicked on it. Inside, there were stories from people who had been through similar ordeals. They shared tips on how to stay safe, how to fight back. It was a glimmer of hope in the darkness. I reached out to a few of the users, hoping to connect with others who understood what I was going through. One of them, a user named Shadow, responded. We started exchanging messages, and I learned that Shadow had been one of the first players of the game. They had managed to escape, but not without scars, both physical and emotional. Shadow taught me how to navigate the dark web more effectively, how to cover my tracks and protect myself from being watched. They became my mentor, my guide through the labyrinth of the underworld. Together, we started piecing together information, trying to uncover the identities of the people behind the game. Months passed, and I slowly regained a semblance of normalcy. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of my mind, but I had learned to live with it. I kept my guard up, always ready for the next move. And then, one day, I received an email from Shadow. I found something. Meet me. The location was a remote cabin in the woods, far from prying eyes. I was hesitant, but I trusted Shadow. They had been my lifeline in this nightmare, and if they had found something, I needed to know. I packed a bag, grabbed my phone and a few essentials, and headed out. The drive was long and tense, every passing car making my heart race. I finally arrived at the cabin, a small weathered building surrounded by dense forest. I parked my car and approached cautiously. Shadow was waiting for me, a hooded figure standing in the doorway. "Shadow?" I called out, my voice shaky. They nodded and gestured for me to come inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with just a table, a few chairs, and a laptop set up in the corner. Shadow motioned for me to sit down and opened the laptop. On the screen was a series of files, documents, and videos. "I've been tracking them for years," Shadow said, the voice low and steady. "I think I finally found a lead. These files contain information on some of the key players. It's not much, but it's a start." I leaned in, my eyes scanning the screen. Names, locations, encrypted messages. It was a treasure trove of information. "How did you find this?" I asked, my voice filled with awe and fear. "Persistence," Shadow replied, "and a bit of luck. But we need to be careful. They know we're onto them. They won't go down without a fight." We spent the next few hours going over the files, formulating a plan. We would leak the information to the authorities, to the media, to anyone who could help bring these monsters to justice. It was risky, but it was the only way to end the game once and for all. As I left the cabin, I felt a sense of determination I hadn't felt in a long time. This was it. My chance to fight back, to take control of my life again. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. But I had allies now, people who understood the darkness and were willing to stand with me. The game had taken so much from me, my peace, my sanity, my innocence, but it had also given me a purpose. I wasn't just a player anymore. I was a warrior, fighting against the shadows that sought to consume me. And as long as I had breath in my body, I would keep fighting. The game might never end, but neither would my resolve. I drove back home, the dawn breaking over the horizon, casting a hopeful light on the world. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. The game had tried to break me, but I was still standing, and I was ready for whatever came next. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Shadow and I worked tirelessly, leaking the information we had gathered to trusted contacts. We made sure it reached law enforcement agencies and journalists around the world. The game was no longer our secret tormentor. It was being dragged into the light. The authorities launched a series of investigations and raids based on the intel we provided. Several arrests were made, and dark web forums buzzed with rumors of the game's imminent collapse. But we knew better than to get complacent. The people behind the game were powerful, resourceful, and ruthless. They wouldn't go down without a fight. Despite the progress, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every step I took, every decision I made was shadowed by the lingering fear that the game could strike back at any moment. I had to stay vigilant, keep moving, and remain one step ahead. One night, as I was going over the latest reports, I received a message from Shadow. "We need to meet. Urgent." My heart pounded as I read the message. Shadow rarely used the word urgent. I grabbed my bag, checked my surroundings, and headed to the new meeting spot we had agreed on. An abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect place for a clandestine meeting. far from prying eyes. I arrived to find Shadow waiting, their face obscured by a hood. "What's going on?" I asked, anxiety tightening my chest. Shadow motioned for me to sit. "We've uncovered something big. There's a core group, the masterminds. We finally have their identities." My breath caught. This was the breakthrough we had been hoping for. "Who are they?" Shadow handed me a folder filled with documents and photos. High-ranking officials, wealthy entrepreneurs, people in positions of power. They've been running the game for years, using it to manipulate and control. I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling. It was a who's who of the elite untouchables who believed they were above the law. How do we take them down? Shadow's eyes glinted with determination. We expose them, publicly. Use their own tactics against them. Leak their identities, their crimes, everything. They thrive in the shadows. We drag them into the light. It was a risky plan, but it was our best shot. We spent the next few weeks compiling evidence, ensuring every detail was accurate and irrefutable. When we were ready, we released the information simultaneously across multiple platforms, social media, news outlets, whistleblower sites. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The world watched in shock as the hidden puppet masters were unmasked. Protests erupted, and calls for justice echoed across the globe. Governments were forced to act, and the accused found themselves in the crosshairs of public outrage and legal scrutiny. But the victory came at a cost. The game's retribution was swift. Shadow went dark, their usual lines of communication falling silent. I tried to reach out, but there was no response. Fear gnawed at me, but I couldn't afford to lose focus. I had to stay strong, for Shadow, for myself, and for the countless others who had suffered. Days turned into weeks, and the world continued to reel from the revelations. Arrests were made, trials began, and slowly the game's grip loosened. I kept a low profile, knowing that while the masterminds were being brought to justice, their loyal followers were still out there, waiting for their chance to strike back. One evening, as I was sifting through the latest news reports, I received a message from an unknown number. "You did it. Stay safe. Shadow." Relief washed over me. Shadow was alive. We had struck a blow against the darkness, but the war was far from over. The game might never truly end, but neither would our fight. I moved again, changed my identity, and continued to monitor the remnants of the game. I knew that vigilance was my best defense. The scars of my ordeal would never fully heal, but they served as a reminder of my strength, my resilience. In the end, the game had tried to break me, but it had only made me stronger. The shadows might always be there, lurking at the edges of my vision, but I was no longer afraid. I had faced the darkness and emerged with a newfound resolve. The game might never end, but as long as I drew breath, I would keep fighting, for myself, for Shadow, and for everyone who had fallen victim to the twisted machinations of the unseen puppeteers. The war continued, but I was ready. The light of truth was my weapon, and I would wield it with unwavering determination.